Hi everyone and welcome to this month's long tutorial. And this month I'm dealing with Brindle fur and I'm using Pastelmat paper for this project. And I found Pastelmat the perfect choice for building up such a fine detailed coat like this. And if you've just joined me on Patreon and this is your first tutorial, you might notice that they are much longer than I originally had expected. So I thought I would bring out one-hour tutorial each month. But as it turned out, that just didn't provide me with enough time to give you lots of real-time footage and enough instruction to really be helpful to you. So this month, there will be about 3 hours in total, and I will release it in parts of roughly 1 hour each. So this is part 1 of painting Brindle fur on Pastelmat. Hope you enjoy. So for this project, I'm going to try and share as much of the greyhound's face as possible. Unfortunately, I won't be able to show you the entire project as this literally took me days and days. Brindle fur is one of those things that just takes so long to create. So I'm going to focus on the top part of the dog's head and really show you in detail how I build up the texture and colours of Brindle. I'll try and show you a few other bits of the project as well, and I'll also be using some of the background in this piece to make a tutorial very soon on painting soft fabrics and textures like that you often find in the backgrounds and foregrounds of your portraits. So that will be a tutorial coming very soon. But for this project, the main aim was to show you the Brindle coat, as it's one of the coats that I find the most tricky to build up, and it certainly takes the most amount of patience, but it's such a useful coat type to paint. You can cover many different breeds with this type of coat once you get the knack of it. And so just starting off, as always, trying to block in a few of the darkest areas, then using BE36, a very dark brown. Again, just trying to block in some dark areas. And even at this stage, I'm trying to think of the direction that the fur is flowing. And just giving those marks a light rub into the paper. So even though this is Pastelmat and not my usual velour, I still do a fair amount of blending and rubbing the lower layers into the paper. A problem that you can often find if you're trying to apply light colours over the top of dark is if there's too much pigment sitting on the surface of the paper. So if it's sitting loosely on the paper, you'll find it very difficult to put clean marks on top of that. So for instance here, with this little bit of A33, and I'm just starting to pick out some of the highlighted edge of the ear. But it's not my brightest highlight colour because this ear is also on the shadow side of the dog, so I don't want it to be too bright. But you can see how cleanly those light marks go on top of the dark. And that's partly to do with the quality of Pastelmat paper. It allows many layers, but also giving your lower layers, the dark colours, a bit of a rub into the paper will really help how cleanly your light colours go on top. And I'm really beginning to love Pastelmat. I've been using velour paper, not exclusively, but for about 10 years, and I've grown really comfortable on it. I can produce most things on velour, but I certainly find for the more detailed face portraits like this, I may well use Pastelmat in future, as you can get so much fine detail. And that's not something that I always want to be able to get, but certainly in this case where it's a lovely fine Brindle coat and there's lots of fine detail in the face, it was just perfect for this. So hopefully I will have some more Pastelmat tutorials coming very soon. But as many of you know already, it's also possible to use these tutorials and try the same thing on another paper. I've seen some of your paintings which were done from a tutorial where I was using one paper, and then the patron has tried it on another paper. So You can use the same techniques, the same skills that I'm showing you here will work on any paper across the board. And as always, I'm making use of the Faber-Castell Pitt pencils. For a Brindle coat, you'll see me use the pencils quite a lot. Again, I'm still applying most of my colour using the bigger Unison sticks. And this is one of my favourites, Grey 8. Even with the big sticks, you can usually find a small edge on there somewhere. And using BE1, just where this top part of the head comes round into the sunlight. The colours all get a little warmer over this side of the head. So where I used A33, quite a neutral grey colour, then that turns into a warmer, creamy colour over on the sunlit side of the face. So even at this early stage, just trying to pick out some of my highlights, get the shape of the top of the head. And I know a few of you have been wondering what the difference is between some of the pastel pencil brands. I've used Derwent pencils, I've used Carbothellos, and I currently use mostly Faber-Castell Pitt pencils. So the Derwents, they're a little harder. The Pitt pencils I find just perfect because they're quite easily sharpened, and their leads don't break very easily, but you still get a reasonable strength of colour from them on the papers. And the Carbothellos, I think, may be a slight bit softer than the Pitt pencils, but quite similar. I have got some Carbothello pencils in my collection too, and I make use of them. They're great. So if I were choosing, it would be either Carbothellos or Pitt pencils by Faber-Castell. And both of those are quite soft. But in my opinion, you still need the soft pastels to get the strength of colour. And the pastel pencils really just for tweaking things into shape and very, very fine details. So as well as lots of brown tones, you'll also see me use lots of purples and blues and different colours in the coat. This is lovely A29, which has a lovely purple, plum purple tone to it. And there's so many different colours through a Brindle coat. So at this stage, I'm just experimenting with some purple colours. This is dark 14. And I really try to avoid having a subject be all shades of brown or any very dull colours. I really try and bring in some of the primary colours and some more unusual shades into the coat. And when you really look hard, when you start to look really hard for all of these colours, you will see them in there. So there really are lots of purple tones running through this Brindle coat. And it's just about training your eye to see all those different subtle shades. And I promise that comes with time. Even Andrew, from doing the colour codes on these videos, has started to see colour in terms of unison codes. And even he says that he's starting to see such a bigger range of colour in everything that he looks at. So I remember the same experience happening to me when I first really started to get colour theory and being able to look for extra colours in your painting reference. And I just remember the wonderful feeling of being able to see so many extra colours from then on. So it really is something that will come with time. Keep practicing, trying to pick up colours of pastel that you don't often use and see if you can find a place for them. Be experimental with your colour and really try to push it. So I'm using this dark 14 here. Over on the sunlit side of the face, I don't want to use anything too harsh in between and on the lower layers. So I'm just lightly making these marks in the direction that the fur flows over the top of the head. And I'll speed up a couple of areas within the painting as this is quite repetitive stuff. So I'm just using my black Faber-Castell stick. Trying to mark in some of the direction of the fur and make some decisions at this stage about where those stripes come down around the forehead. And it's been a tricky angle of a portrait, this. If the dog's head was face on looking at us, it might be a little easier to get the symmetry of these markings. So I had to be really careful where I was placing these stripes just to make sure that I get the pattern of the dog's face just right. But I'm still using my black stick here, just doing some blocking in with the darkest tones. And back in with some grey 8. It's a great shadowy tone, and you'll have seen me use it a lot if you've followed some of my videos. And saving that kind of tone for the left side of the face, which is in shadow. And later on then you'll see me use some of my lightest colours and brightest highlights on the other side of the face to represent that sunlight hitting that side. And just using the pastel pencil to make very small adjustments. And to work those edges. I've gone for quite a plain background in this piece. Just letting our focus be fully on Gigi the greyhound and her lovely soft bed. And with this project, it was my first attempt at trying to create soft fabrics on Pastelmat. And I think that's why this piece took me so much extra time. Just figuring out how to create that background, I found it quite tricky. So I think that might become a good tutorial in future. I've got quite a lot of footage now of painting sofas, leather sofas, fabric sofas, cushions, blankets, all the sorts of things that you commonly find in the background of your pet portraits especially. I think I've possibly painted as many sofas as I have dogs, so it's something that I really enjoy though, painting fabrics, and it adds so much extra to your portraits, having some surroundings. Sometimes a head portrait on its own is really effective and just perfect for the job. But I find that once you break into the world of being able to paint backgrounds and other textures, it really opens up your paintings to a whole other world. And it gives you the scope of being able to improve upon photo reference, create better compositions. So yeah, that will be a very good tutorial, I think, which I'll do very soon, one on painting fabrics. And so because I'm using quite a lot of purple within this coat, I can also see a lot of yellow tones running through. And I know that because purple and yellow are opposite colours on the colour wheel, that will make a really lovely contrast within my painting to have those colours dance off each other. And this is yellow 16, which might seem like a strange choice. It's quite a vibrant yellow. And I'll use more of it later in the Brindle. And you'll see how using a vibrant colour then can blend into all the other colours and just give your painting that little touch of vibrance. So don't be afraid sometimes to go a little brighter, a little more saturation in your colour choices than you might originally think. I'm sure you've noticed that as you progress through your pastel painting, sometimes the colours can dull a little as excess dust gets perhaps blown over the rest of the painting. So going a little more saturated sometimes is a good thing, and by the end of the painting everything has toned down and looks normal again. But I certainly like to use some vibrant colours through my work. And using some more BE1. Just trying to pick out some of the highlights on the right ear. And I work on at that ear on the right for a little while. And some artists work on eyes first. I tend to work on ears first, just because quite logically they're at the top of the head, and as I move down the face, the fur gets layered up, one layer on top of the next, and it seems to work best from top to bottom. So ears always seem to get my attention first. Plus I find them a great place to experiment on, figure out my colour palette. Usually by the time I'm onto the main part of the dog's face, I've got quite a few of the colours that I need out and around me. So I start to come in with a few lighter colours using my BE1 here, just to pick out the shape of this side of the face. And when a project like this is so big and there's so much to it, it can seem quite daunting. So by focusing on one small area of the dog's head at this stage, it gives me a few advantages. It lets me not get too overwhelmed with the entire piece. And it also gives me plenty of space to lean my hands and not destroy any painting that's underneath. But the main part in a project like this is to take your time and really try not to feel overwhelmed by the task ahead. And I've had to face so many paintings like this where it just seems impossible to get the level of detail that I would like and right across the whole painting. But I just find that by breaking it down into bite-sized pieces, not letting myself rush away to finish it as quickly as possible, really focusing in on smaller areas sometimes helps me get through a big, complicated project. And you can see when I add some of that yellow 16 over on this side of the head, I can use my pastel pencil to come back in and overlap some of those darker hairs with the light colour that I've just put down. So with Brindle, it's all about creating those layers and stripes and the multicoloured effect that runs through the coat. And you can see when I add this yellow, it does look pretty bright. But there are so many layers to go on top that it will inevitably calm down a little bit in the mix. And this is BE29, just continuing that stripe down to where it meets the cushion. So it's in quite a lot of shadow in there. And I really want to keep the colours nice and warm as they'll be reflecting some of that lovely yellow light coming from the cushion. But usually after I apply some of my darker colours with Brindle, I'll try and come in with some of these vibrant colours as my mid-tones. And as I blend and add highlights on top of this later, hopefully all those colours should come together. And now again I come back in with the black Faber-Castell and do a bit more work down the forehead here in between the eyes. So for the next few moments I'm just building in some of the darker layers first, trying to follow the grain of the fur. But when you look at a brindle coat, you've really got to look at all the layers, not just the top colour that you can see. So really try to look in between the colours. Try and spot any colours in there that you can put in a previous layer. The more layers you add to this coat, the better it will look. So you've really got to build it up gradually, starting from your darkest colours. And that's just what I am doing here with the black Faber-Castell. My first layer, adding the texture and the contrast in there, which will need to be visible through my lighter layers. So once I've got a good bit more of that first dark layer in, I come back in with some dark 14, lovely rich purple, and my BE36, quite a dark brown colour. And between those two colours and the black, that seems to make up a lot of my base layer. Just judging if it needs black where it's really heavily contrasted and very dark, and quite often over towards this side of the greyhound's face where the sunlight is hitting, I'll be using more of the brown and the purple as the underlayers. And I really take my time marking in these different stripes, making sure that each one matches up to where the features are. So I'm very mindful of my proportions and keeping everything in the right place in this piece because, as I said earlier, the portrait is at an angle. It's very easily to let everything get a bit skewed in perspective. Even when drawing this out initially, it was very tricky to get the eye in the correct place because it's just not an angle that we're used to seeing an eye at. It's completely up on its side. So this was quite a tricky portrait from the proportions side of things. And the lovely thing that I'm finding about Pastelmat is being able to sketch straight onto the paper. I can't really do that with velour as you can't rub out. But I was able to, with a black pastel pencil, sketch straight onto the Pastelmat for this piece. But as far as I'm aware, if you're using the transfer method, by covering the back of your sketch or your trace with some dark pastel and then going over that on top of your pastel paper. And I think this works pretty well for Pastelmat too. Your lines should come out pretty clearly. I've heard a few of you talking about using transfer papers which use like charcoal or carbon-based media. You might find it difficult to get a clear line on the paper from this, or you might find it difficult to get rid of that line in your painting. And one of the reasons that I use a dark coloured pastel for my transfer images is so that it's the same media as I'm working in, so the pastel outline disappears nicely into my pastel painting. I think if I were using a different material to do my outline, it may be hard to get rid of some of the lines later on. But again, this is all things that depend on what paper you're using, what pastels you're using. The experience is slightly different for all of us as we use slightly different tools. And you can see here I spend a long time on the darker layers, mostly because I'm still plotting the shapes, making sure I've got everything in the right place before committing to brighter colours. And just trying to make sure that I have really enough contrast down there before adding my lighter colours. If you're using a good pastel paper like Pastelmat or Velour or the UArt paper, one of the good papers will allow you to add many, many layers of pastels. So don't be afraid to go good and dark in the beginning. You really need that contrast there. And trust that your lighter highlights will go over the top of this later on. So now I can start to bring some lighter colours in on the top of the head. And I'm just using a white pastel pencil here just to accentuate that top area of the head that's really catching the light. And coming in with some BE14, starting to bring some of the little highlighted hairs down over the top of the skull. And the thing that I find with Pastelmat is that when you have a dark layer applied and you add some lighter marks over the top, you can really see the definition of your mark. It's such a clear mark on top of the dark. And that my main problem, I think, on Pastelmat was making sure that I could keep the whole overall appearance looking really soft and fur-like. So I still find myself blending, rubbing those layers into the layer below each time, just softening it slightly. And then back in with my yellow 16. And at this point, I'm just keeping a really close eye on my photo reference, making sure that I don't add any of these lovely stripes in a bit skewed. But pastel is such a forgiving medium. There's always room for tweaking and refining, moving things around when they're a little out of place. I find it such a great medium to work in and to teach in as well, because you can work in such a variety of different styles. You don't have to panic if something goes a bit wrong. Quite often you can fix things, work over the top. But here I'm really just trying to figure out exactly where this stripe comes from and where it goes to, and try and visualize that on the painting before I make any marks. Then just using that lovely sharp edge on the bigger pastel stick, I can bring those little marks around in a sort of fan shape as they come round towards the eyebrow. So this is really the groundwork for the brindle, trying to get the darkest areas in, then using some more vibrant mid-tones, trying to mark in where the stripes go. Then with both light pastel pencils and dark pastel pencils, I can come back in and really tweak at each little area, just getting the different layers to overlap. Each stripe within the brindle seems to run into the next stripe. And it really works, as I said earlier, working from the top of the dog down, as you can see how these all get layered on top of each other. But unlike some breeds and some types of fur where my use of pastel pencil is quite minimal, this is definitely a breed where I do make use of those sharp points quite a lot. So if I'm working on an Alsatian or German Shepherd, lots of different dog coat types like this. And I usually find that the shorter haired coats I end up using quite a bit of pastel pencil just to tweak everything into shape and make everything super fine. And just being careful to notice the direction of the fur as it changes, as the flesh goes over an important bit of structure on the greyhound's face. So where it turns the corner here around the side of the face. Just being sure that I get the direction of the fur marks, given the impression of how it flows over the dog's skull underneath. And then with some of those darker areas within the brindle, I like to come back in with some of my other colours and break that whole area up, adding more colour into it, but still being able to see my rich dark marks underneath. And this purple tone, A29, just works so beautifully along with the yellows. I think a big part of the trick of painting realistically is to try and avoid using too much black or white to lighten and darken things. So you're always looking for other colours to make an area dark or light. And you can honestly go a bit mad with your colour choices as long as you get the values of them right. So how dark or light it is. If you turn all your colours into grayscale, you'll very quickly see how dark or light they are without the hue of the colour being involved. And if you create a painting where all your colour values, how dark or light it is spot on, you can really go quite exaggerated on your colour choices. And you'll see a lot of artists do that where they call it pushing their colour values. And I still tend to be on the realism side of that, so I don't go too impressionistic with my colour choices. But all the colours that I add into my work, it's only in there because I can see it in the photo reference. So when I look really closely at this brindle greyhound, I do see a lot of purples and a lot of blue violets, lots of yellows. And again, as I said earlier, that's just, it will come with time and practice. One of my best tips for improving your colour work is to take a photo reference into Photoshop if you have it. And you can actually use a colour picker on there to physically pick out the colours from the photo reference. And I guarantee that you'll always be quite surprised at how dark they are in comparison to what your eye thinks you're seeing. So it's a good exercise to do just to get a bit more comfortable with seeing colours as they really are. So at this point, I can start to bring in some of the highlight colours. And this is BE14, a little piece of that, even though it looks very dirty here. And followed by some BE8, two light tones that I'll use for many of the highlights through the coat. And just always turning the pieces of pastel. You can see this little piece has many sharp edges and even bigger chunks of pastel like this. There's always an edge somewhere. But I often break pastels in half. I quite often drop them by accident. And after the initial annoyance of that, I realised there's lots of little shards that I can use for fine detail. I'm working on a big harbour piece at the moment, and there's lots of little buildings around the harbour, And I've dropped so many pieces of pastel on the floor in front of me. And each time I've been rewarded with tiny little shards that have helped me create windows and doorways and chimneys. So it's a good thing to have lots of little pieces of pastel eventually. But now I can start to add some strength to the lighter patches of fur and also start to break up some of the darker areas with some highlight colours. But you can see how long I spend on those lower layers. They're really important. Before you start adding many lighter colours, you really need to have a good depth there before. If you come in too soon with your light colours, you'll lose all the definition in the coat. And in Brindle, it really goes from jet black to bright white, from one hair to the next in some parts of the brindle. So you need all of those parts to be really well defined and nicely layered up so that it looks convincingly thick like a dog's coat. And I'm constantly going back through with the darker pencils, just tweaking at small edges as I notice things, or going back into my dark areas, like often inside ears, and just making them really dark again, as the pastel dust as I work sometimes lightens these dark areas. And now just continuing down the forehead, starting to pick out some of that pattern as it comes down in between the eyes. So here I'm using a piece of A19, just as this brighter area continues round the corner of the dog's eyebrow and into the shadow area. And the idea here is to use those slightly more vibrant colours above. And then this is a slightly duller choice for where it disappears into shadow. So I'm thinking about how the light is hitting the dog the whole way around the shape of the head. And even if I know that the stripe I'm looking at was all the same colour on the dog, I know as it disappears into shadow, I need a different colour to represent it in that area. So you're constantly thinking about how your colour choices change as they come around an object that's been hit by light. And that works the same in every subject matter, but even in the small details in fur, it really affects your colour choices. So this is BE8, and it's a little more vibrant, and I'm keeping it out in this area, away from the shadow. And again, blending all those marks into the layers below. But you'll notice that when I've only got the dark layer and some highlights on there, it looks pretty rough. Whereas the areas where I've applied many, many more layers, like on the top of the head, that's really starting to look a lot softer and more fur-like. So you've got to get it from this early stage with some blending and a lot more layers usually. I think that's usually the main problem that I notice when people are painting fur, and especially this type of fur. It just requires so many layers of pastel, and not thick layers, but you can see how I'm applying the pastel here, small marks. But it really does eventually give that effect of the depth of the fur. And coming back into some of the dark areas with a Terry Ludwig dark pastel. And I really like using this particular colour. Sometimes when I've got a lot of black in a piece, I'll go back through it with this really rich purpley brown. And it just softens, warms the black area. So if you can use something similar like the A29 purple, or just something dark and rich that isn't black, you can really warm up your black areas. So I've got the left side of the face starting to take shape, and I make a start working on down the right side. And I love working on the side of the face that's been hit by sunlight, as you get to add all your brightest highlights there, and all of a sudden something really comes to life when you see its brightest area. But like I did elsewhere, using my BE36, trying to plot out this side of the face, as there are a lot of different layers as her neck disappears behind the collar. And I'm just being very careful as I plot that out, that I get her cheekbone in the right place, that line that comes down below her eye sends her cheek in the right direction. So each little section on a brindle dog, it's very divided. You can see, you can hone in on tiny sections, but at the same time make sure that you take a step back and look at the overall picture, that you're getting all the proportions correct. And I'm using a bit of white here just to pick out this right side of the head. The highlights on this side of the dog are pretty bright, and although this will get softened in, I know I need those edges around the outside of the dog's face to be pretty bright. And as always, coming back in with the pastel pencils, not having to lean very heavily. I find that the pencils go onto the Pastelmat paper really nicely. And looking for those areas of shadow just in around where the collar meets the dog's neck. So this piece really isn't a huge palette of colours, it's quite limited, although I do try and include some more vibrant colours. But it's not a huge number. And if you don't have many of these colours, always remember you can substitute for colours close to what you've got. Hopefully by adding the colour codes in my tutorials, this will help you to match to something close that you have. The idea is to create your own style from the materials that you're using. And it's great when you see a colour that I use a lot. And I have many colours that I find so useful, which is why I created the animal set for Unison. But at the same time, I did start out with really cheap brands of pastel. My sister, who did A-level art before me, had a lot of cheap student grade pastels which she gave to me, and I started my professional life as an artist using those same pastels, and over time I've managed to upgrade to the better quality. So you can still get a great result with poor quality materials, but it does make your life a lot harder. So hopefully by having the colour codes here though, it really helps you see what type of colours I choose in certain situations, and hopefully open your eyes to a whole extra world of colour that you may not have had access to before. And at the same time, as you progress as an artist, you'll find that your own style will emerge and you'll find your own favourite colours to use within your portraits. But I hope that this helps you experiment, be a little braver in your colour choices. And again, just coming back in with the A29, breaking up some of the dark areas, letting some of the dark colours go into the light areas and vice versa, because it's not as straightforward as stripes in Brindle. Which I think is why it's one of the most tricky furs to paint. So in the next two parts of this tutorial, you'll see me finish this whole top half of the head. And I'm going to try and show you a little of the brindle from down the dog's back to where the sunlight's hitting. And I've showed you many dog's eyes and other features, so I'll try and whiz through those in this tutorial. The main focus here is just that laborious task of building up Brindle. So I wish you luck, because I'm giving you 3 hours of this stuff. But I hope you find it really useful, because it's definitely one of the most labour-intensive furs to paint if you want to paint it very realistically. I think brindle, followed by curls, and possibly the type of hair that a Pomeranian or a Chow Chow have. Those would be my 3 toughest furs to paint. I think very soon I'll do a tutorial on curls, as so many dogs seem to have those. Using little pieces of A19 here. And using a small piece of A19 here, I'm just trying to soften the shape of that dark area. I don't want the edges of any of these shapes to be too harsh. So I try and graduate some little marks into the dark area, just to take away the harshness of the outline. And this is why you really need to use a proper pastel paper, especially for this type of effect. You can see how important it is that those light marks go on top of the dark area cleanly. But already the top of the head is starting to take shape. But there's still a lot of work to do in the middle of the head. And I use some grey 8. Again, just picking up any of those highlights in the dark areas. And my dark areas on the left side of the face, where it's in shadow, I want those to remain pretty dark. But over here, where the light is hitting the top of the head, you'll find a lot of highlights through those dark areas. And that's really the main trick of creating a realistically 3D subject. Just really focus on where the light is hitting and try to stay really controlled in your color choices in the bright areas and the shadow areas. So I hope you've enjoyed this first hour. There'll be the next hour, part 2, coming very soon. Thanks for watching.